Good evening, and welcome to a delightful audience for what is going to be, I think, a fascinating and challenging lecture. I'm David Ellis, the interim head of the Harvard Museum of Natural History, and it's really my pleasure to welcome all of you here today for the third installment of the museum's four-part spring lecture series. Well, here. Tom, why don't you go ahead and I'll read here. This series was started earlier this month with a talk by Nobel Prize winner Jack Szostak from the Harvard Medical School, who discussed his research on RNA and unraveling the mystery of the origins of life. Ian Cozen from Princeton gave a talk last month about collective democratic behavior in groups of animals. And tonight we have the third in our series, Randolph Nesse from the University of Michigan, here to discuss the emerging field of evolutionary medicine. Before I introduce Dr. Nesse, two announcements. The last talk in our series is May 2nd by Jerry Coyne from the University of Chicago, who will discuss the thesis of his book of the same title, Why Evolution is True. That talk will be in our normal location next door at the HMNH, 26 Oxford Street. Now, the two previous talks are now on our website, as will this one be in about 2 weeks, and we hope you will avail yourself of that. It's really something, it's a great addition for those who either can't be here or would like to go back and review part of what they heard. Now, I'd also like to recognize Dr. Herman Suit and Dr. Joan Suit, who are with us tonight in the audience for their generous sponsorship of this series. Herman and Joan, thank you. Tonight's distinguished speaker is Dr. Randy Nesse, one of the foremost researchers in the emergent field of evolutionary psychology and Darwinian medicine, with an emphasis on the origins and functions of emotions involved in psychopathology. Dr. Nesse holds several appointments at the University of Michigan. He's currently professor of psychology and professor of psychiatry. He's senior scientist at the Research Center for Group Dynamics and director of the Evolution Human Adaptation Program. Dr. Nesse is the author of numerous articles and scholarly papers on various issues in medicine and health, as well as an influential book for the general audience titled Why We Get Sick, published in 1995. His research and his ideas have contributed enormously to our understanding of evolution, whether studied in academia or understood and of interest to the general public. And that could be evidenced by a very long list of distinctions and honors. Now, we'd be here for a long time if I read them all, so I won't. So I'll turn it over immediately to Dr. Nesse. Thank you.
Okay, I will. Thanks so much for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here with you all tonight, and I especially appreciate Dr. Suit and Dr. Suit making this possible for us. I also really appreciate Jerry Coyne, who I talked with at a SSE meeting last summer, and he thought this might be a good idea. I'm really glad he recommended this. I think it'll all work out very well. You see on the first slide, we have my colleague and friend, George Williams, who passed away 2 years ago, without whom we would not be here. This whole field would not exist if it wasn't for George. And it also would not exist if it wasn't for the University of Michigan Museum of Natural History. I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking of when I just finished my residency program and I was a junior faculty member. I do know what I was thinking of. I was thinking about senescence, even though I was young. And I was thinking about why senescence exists, which is a problem that preoccupied me ever since I was a sophomore undergraduate. And so I started hanging out with the biologists at the museum. And I didn't know these guys. There was this guy named Bill Hamilton. He seemed really smart. For those of you who might not be biologists, he's one of the leading biologists of the 20th century. George Williams came by quite often. Richard Alexander helped. Barbara Smuts was there. Richard Wrangham was there. All kinds of the greatest people in the world were there, and I just thought they were regular folks, but they were pretty nice to me as a doctor who was interested but ignorant about evolution. And a lot has come from it. I started trying to figure out if I could find a biologist to work with to develop evolutionary applications in medicine, and lo and behold, this fellow George Williams, who I hadn't realized had revolutionized certain areas of biology, said, well, I'm looking for a doctor to work with to write a book on evolution in medicine. First, we wrote an article, which he insisted on grandly titling it, The Dawn of Darwinian Medicine. I said, George, can't we do something more modest? He said, no. I said, well, how about evolutionary medicine? He said, Darwin discovered it, we're giving him credit. I said, okay. We argued, I was more successful in some of my other arguments with George, but for those, he won. A lot's come from this. It's been 20 years now. First, what we're talking about. This is evolutionary medicine, the same as Darwinian medicine. This is just a field that uses the basic science of evolutionary biology to try to understand problems in medicine and public health, to understand, prevent, and treat disease. It's just like genetic medicine, but the basic science is not genetics, it's evolutionary biology. You might think that this had been done 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and I keep wondering if we're going to discover a bunch of textbooks sitting there we never found. But it turns out that there's been this big gulf between evolutionary biology and medicine, which it's up to many of the people in this room to help bridge. So we begin with the real beginnings of it, with Darwin. There's something funny about this slide. The purport of the following pages, Darwin says, is an endeavor to reduce the facts belonging to animal life into classes, order, genre, and species, and by comparing them with each other to unravel the theory of diseases. Did you know Darwin was the very first evolutionary medicine guy? But there's something funny about this. Darwin was not a twinkle in his mother's eye, even. Charles Darwin in 1794. This, in fact, was Erasmus Darwin, and these are the very opening lines of Zoonomia, his famous and somewhat sexy poem that took the British Isles by storm. He was a rotund physician. On his carriage, he had his motto, everything from snails. And the local vicar said, sorry, Dr. Darwin, get that off your carriage or I will see to it you have no more cases. And so he painted it over on his carriage. This conflict kind of stuff has been going on for a long time. So what are the origins of evolution in medicine? First of all, Erasmus Darwin, a physician. His son, Robert Darwin, a physician. And these physicians ate well. Robert Darwin is 350 pounds. This is a well-fed physician. And then there's a more lightweight fellow in terms of his robustness, Charles Darwin, who tried medical school and dropped out. Who inspired Darwin to get into all of these ideas? You know, people talk about creationism and intelligent design and that kind of thing, which is not our business here, but it's important to recognize that William Paley, who wrote Natural Theology, really the foundation stone for a lot of intelligent design, he was the inspiration for Darwin. Darwin read this book at Cambridge, and what Darwin said about it was, the logic of Paley's evidences of Christianity and of his natural theology gave me as much delight as Euclid. The careful study of these works was the only part of the academical course at Cambridge for 4 years, which was of the least use to me in the education of my mind. Why? Because it's a wonderful book. It's just a wonderful book. If you want to look at someone analyzing nature and the body with extreme acute observation, it's just a wonderful book. He was really spot on. Paley's explanation for these things was somewhat different than the ones Darwin would describe, but observation is where we start in science, and it's good no matter what theory you use. Darwin observed pigeons, and he raised pigeons. He asked the question, do they all come from the same stock, or do they come from different species? And I use a slide like this when I'm trying to explain to audiences about selection. Selection is when inherited variations in a trait influence the numbers of offspring. The trait will change over generations. I try to make it as simple as possible. And it doesn't matter how simple, it turns out it's a subtle concept, this business of selection. And I learned that almost traumatically at a meeting in Italy a little over 10 years ago. We were at the Spallettazienza, dedicated entirely to evolutionary medicine, an audience of a couple of thousand people just outside of Rome. And Steve Gould was there, and I wondered what he was going to say about my talk, because a lot of my talk was about adaptation and things that he sometimes had a little bit of skepticism about. So I was very eager to see his response to my talk. And Steve says, "Nice talk, Nesse." I thought, And then he goes on and he says, "But they had no idea what you were talking about." I said, "What do you mean, Steve?" And he says, "You didn't explain how selection works in evolution. You assume they know that? They don't understand that." So ever since, for every audience, I try my best in 2 minutes to at least talk about what we're talking about. Selection. I think we get ourselves all tangled up in knots talking about natural selection. Let's talk about selection. Selection is what we're talking about. If individuals of any kind, teacups, pennies, coins, vary on a trait that influences the number of offspring passed on, and that variation is passed on, then the group will change over the generations. This is not a theory. This has to be true. And most of you have at home a penny jar. I'll ask you to explain for me, why is your penny jar colored brown and not a nice mixture of brown and silver? It's selection. Your penny jar started off like this with a nice mixture of coins. You throw a random bunch in there, but you take out a non-random collection of coins. And after a few months, your jar starts looking like this. Eventually, you get to take it to the grocery store and dump it into a machine. Whenever variation influences future representation in the group is going to change. For students who are living in really cheap apartments near Cambridge, if there are any still, you probably have a collection of glasses in your cupboard, and I can tell you what your collection of glasses are like. They're a motley mixture of all kinds of glasses that are not too fragile, those are broken, not too nice, those have been stolen, not too small, those are useless, not too large, those don't fit in the dishwasher. It's a motley collection of sturdy glasses nobody else wants. And the explanation for those glasses is selection. It's everywhere. What's on television? We could go on. Selection also shapes adaptations. And the key principle here is it's within species variation. All those graphs showing humans emerging from some other, that's confusing. Within species, these are Hawaiian honey creepers. And there's one thing different about all of these individuals. They have different curves of their beak. That one has kind of a really short one. That's a very curved beak, kind of a straight beak. These honey creepers live by getting nectar from flowers that are curved. This one has a beak too curved to get into the flower. This one has a beak that's a little bit too straight to get into the flower. This one has a beak that's just right. It gets more nectar than the others. It has more eggs. It has more offspring than the others. And as a result, over time, the honey creepers become more like this one. If the flowers change, the beak would change. There's nothing mysterious about this. You can study this in the Hawaiian honey creepers, and it's lovely to study them in Hawaii because we know they all came from the same stock. And we can trace, on the one hand, their phylogeny, showing that stock and how they all diverge from each other. This is the one I was just showing you. They all have different beaks because they eat different foods. Thick beaks for hard seeds, fine beaks for grass seeds. But notice that there are two different things that Darwin discovered, and people don't often appreciate that enough. One is the phylogeny and the unity of all life, but separately, and possibly more important, definitely more important for medicine, he discovered the reason for why traits work so well, adaptation, why the beak is so well suited to its function. In medicine, we all talk about the eye as being so incredibly perfect, and it's really fabulous. Why is it that the only clear tissue in the body is right there, just where it belongs? That's so neat. And then there's an iris that gets bigger when it's dark and smaller when it's, and then the eyes can move right and left, and it's just fabulous. Darwin, in fact, himself said, "I can hardly believe that something like this could be shaped by natural selection." So if you have trouble believing it, you're in very good company. But this is the first 2 years of medical school. Let me take you to the second 2 years of medical school, when you go into the clinic. What do you see then? Somebody blew it. Blind spots. I mean, would you have a camera that has a big hole in the middle of the film? No. You'd never do that. Our eyes have a blind spot. Vessels block the light. The vessels go between the light and the receptor. Stupid. Nearsightedness, cataracts, farsightedness, retinal detachment, and glaucoma. Who designed this thing anyway? It seems like some drunk on a Friday afternoon. It's really a problem. And this is what struck me all through medical school. Some things I saw were so incredibly perfect, it was very hard to believe that natural selection could do them. And some were such botched jobs that it was like some malevolent somebody or another was just out to make our lives full of suffering and sickness. How can we explain how some things are so good and other things are so bad? Now, the problem is that natural selection seems to explain why things work, so it doesn't seem all that relevant. First, let's have you all design a better body, especially for the kids who are in high school here and those who don't do biology. You don't have to have a fancy advanced degree. First thing you do is get rid of the wisdom teeth. You don't really need them. How about the appendix? No, thank you. Let's just pass on that one. How about making your bones stronger? Good idea. Improve the immune responses. Not so much infection. That sounds good. Enlarging the coronary arteries. I'm all for that. I'm all for that. And then, Freud tried to figure out what women want. He didn't know what women want. I know what women want. Women want ooh, come on, go back. Women want a zipper so that babies can exit so much more easily. Silly to go through a bunch of bone? It's ridiculous. So again, why has natural selection made some of the body so perfect and parts of the body botched jobs? This is the question. 153 years after the origin, there's still this huge gap between evolution and medicine. There are few bridges: infectious disease, tracing phylogenies, especially phylogenies of people and bacteria, and genetics. But it's a giant, giant gap. Very few doctors have ever had a chance to learn even the rudiments of evolutionary biology, and I keep being surprised by that. I keep, again, expecting that I'll somehow come someplace and all the doctors will really understand evolution. And then in 2009, this was the 200th birthday of the publication of Darwin's birth. And if you want to be really famous, I encourage you to make sure you publish your big thing exactly 50 years after you're born so you can celebrate the 150 and 200th all together. It was a great year. I got to travel all over the world and talk with audiences about this work. And I heard some of the world's distinguished scientists saying some things that made me really pause. For instance, some said, adult diseases are common because our ancestors were all dead by age 30. That's not true. The average lifespan might have been 30, but a lot of hunter-gatherers who lived to 30 lived to 50 or 60 or 70. And that's not true. Aging exists to make room for new individuals so the species can evolve. Now, I like that idea. That's the idea I had as a sophomore undergraduate that got me into evolutionary medicine. And it wasn't until I reached my colleagues at Michigan and started talking with them and finally got my nerve up and I said, I've got this idea about aging. What do you think? And my dear friend Bobby Lowe was the one. She's a good evolutionary biologist. She says, Nesse, I thought you knew something. You don't know anything. You've never heard of group selection. You've never read Williams. What are you doing here? But she and everybody else turned out to be very nice to me in the long run and explained to me the evolutionary biology that now I think all doctors need to know. What flabbergasts me is we all should catch on to this kind of thing by now. That doesn't work because it's group selection. This is suggesting that traits evolve for the good of the group. Sorry, that doesn't work. Cancer arises from mutations that are needed for evolution to improve the species. One of the world's most distinguished cancer researchers at a giant meeting said that, and that doesn't work. Things can't work for the benefit of the species. New pathogens become mild with time because there's no point in killing your host. It kind of seems sensible for a bug to not want to kill you so it can spread more later, but it doesn't care about you. All it cares about is doing whatever will spread itself the fastest. And of course, it doesn't care about anything. It's just inevitable that it will spread. And finally, old age diseases exist because selection can't influence anything about after menopause. And there's this very simple theory, now seems simple, that Bill Hamilton came up with in 1964, pointing out that the same genes you have are also in your children and in your brothers and sisters and your parents. And therefore, if you do something even after you can't reproduce yourself that makes them live longer or have more offspring, you're helping your own genes. A very fundamental advance in evolutionary biology, but most doctors haven't had a chance to learn it. They've never heard of it. It is coming, however. These two scientists, Roswell and Bergstrom, did an analysis of the connections in the literature between these fields, and this little line is exciting. This is a line from evolution and ecology to medicine direct without passing through neuroscience, psychology, or molecular and cellular biology. This line didn't exist 10 years ago. But now there's a steady stream of people in medicine starting to make use of basic principles in evolutionary biology. We have been celebrating this year the 20th anniversary, and it was very gratifying to have Science write a little article about our article 20 years later. They called it Darwinian's Medicine Drawn Out Dawn, and that's true, actually. It has been somewhat drawn out, but it's getting there. There are all these things that have happened, though, that I'd like to convince you that this field is on a phase of exponential growth now. This is a book George and I wrote. This is one Steve Stearns edited, which is probably the definitive text for the field now. Wonderful book by anthropologists on evolutionary medicine. Paul Ewald is one of the leaders of evolution and infectious disease. And here's what's cool. There's the second edition of that from Oxford Press 2 years ago, second edition of that from Oxford Press, completely rewritten. That's a new textbook of evolutionary medicine by Peter Gluckman, the only New Zealander in the Institute of Medicine in this country. And finally, auf Deutsch, we have a book about evolution and medicine as well. So it's coming pretty quickly now. There's not nearly enough, but we're getting there. Other things that are happening, I had an opportunity to work with a group at the Wissenschaft College in Berlin for a year to try to figure out how we could grow this field of evolution and medicine. We had a Schwerpunkt, a hard-working, focused group. And it turned out to be very productive. One of the things we did is decide we need to communicate somehow. So we created a journal online called the Evolution of Medicine Review. And in that journal, you'll find everything about conferences and meetings and courses, and especially new papers in the field. Once or twice or three times a week, you would get a message if you join. This is a World Health Summit meeting. Interestingly, they call that World Health Summit for leading hospitals from all over the world the Evolution of Medicine. And Detlev Ganten helped that along. We had a symposium on diseases of modern environments. A special issue of PNAS came out in 2010 with a bunch of special issue articles about evolution and medicine. And more recently, we've started a course at Mount Desert Island. It's in Arcadia National Park. We had the first one last year. This is a picture of some of us at our concluding dinner. We're doing it again this year in August. There's a few spots left if anybody's really interested. Focuses on evolution, infectious disease, and cancer. It's probably the only place where you can go and get CME credit for trying to get your feet wet. It's more than your feet wet. A crash course in 1 week on how evolution can be useful in medicine. 2 journals are launching. Paul Ewald has started one called Evolutionary Medicine, and Steve Stearns is going to edit one called Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. Both should be on the newsstands within the next 6 or 8 months. So this is all the origins of new interest in evolution and medicine. Where did it really come from? What was the deal that got this going? There's been a lot of evolution in medicine all along, right? Infectious disease, genetics, phylogenetics, that's not new. I think it's a question. It's not data. It's the question that got us going. Joseph Needham is a famous English philosopher of science who says progress in science consists not so much in finding the right answers as in deciding what questions are sensible. And you can find lots of quotes from famous scientists like this. I also like Jonas Salk. What people think of as the moment of discovery is really the discovery of the question. So these are the characters who I found so inspirational. George standing back here, Ernst Mayr here, and John Maynard Smith. Just appreciated all of them so much. This is at the 1999 Crawford Award. It's the Nobel Prize you get if you're working in evolutionary biology. Ernst Mayr inspired me hugely with his book, The Growth of Biological Thought. Maybe some of you had the privilege of knowing him. I so wish I had been able to. He says, no biological problem is solved until both the proximate and evolutionary causation has been elucidated. Really what he's talking about is the mechanism and why it is that way. Furthermore, the study of evolutionary causes is as legitimate a part of biology as is the study of the usually physical-chemical proximate causes. I read that and I thought, in my whole medical education I've only been studying proximate causes. What if we apply evolutionary causes and try to understand disease from that point of view? Again, Nico Tinbergen and Ernst Mayr are the people we can really thank for this profound distinction, and I consider it the single most important distinction in biology. If you don't get this one, you really can't make sense out of a lot of things. So, George Williams and I started talking for days and weeks, and this makes me sympathetic towards my students. We asked each other, so why did natural selection shape cancer? Why did natural selection shape atherosclerosis? Why did natural selection shape kidney stones. We took these questions very seriously. We were treating these diseases as if they were adaptations shaped by natural selection. Talk about a big mistake. It just was wrong. This is the wrong question. We were never going to get any place. My students still do this. Most people do as they get into the field, but it's a mistake. When we finally asked the right question, we made progress. Why has natural selection left the body so vulnerable to disease? We don't want to explain diseases as if they're adaptations. We want to explain traits that could be a lot better, but aren't. Parts of the body, again, are exquisite, much better than any Mercedes. Parts of the body are really bad, worse than a Yugo on blocks. And the question is, why? So the answer I was taught in medical school, and that most physicians believe, is that the body's basically a machine, and there are parts that wear out or break. This is a proximate approach. And there are limits to what natural selection can do, and this is a profound part of an explanation for why we're vulnerable to disease. However, what George and I finally did over the next year or so is try to figure out, so what are the evolutionary reasons for the body not being so good? Can you see how paradoxical this is? I mean, before we were trying to figure out how evolution makes the body good. Now we're trying to figure out why evolution makes the body really not so good. How do you do that? 6 reasons. 6 reasons. The first is mismatch with the modern environment. We can't evolve as fast as the environment is changing. Second is competition with pathogens. They evolve faster than we can. It's no wonder we get infections. Third, every trait is a trade-off. Nothing can be perfect in the body. Constraints on natural selection. A lot of things natural selection just can't do. Mutations happen. Organisms, turns out, are not shaped for health. I find this very disturbing still. Organisms are not shaped for health. They're shaped for maximum reproductive success. And finally, defenses and suffering like fever, pain, and nausea, those aren't diseases. Those are useful responses shaped by natural selection to help us in certain bad situations. So what I'm going to do in a minute is give you quick examples of each of these, okay? But first I want to emphasize that this angle that George and I have taken is only a small part of evolutionary medicine. And it's so important to realize that what George and Randy are doing is a small part, and there's this much larger field of applying evolution to all the problems in medicine. In particular, 3 methods well established, and the new questions that we're trying to ask, which turn out to be kind of difficult, actually, but very engaging and potentially very important. Now the examples. Mismatch. What diseases are caused by us living in an environment that is very different from the one our ancestors evolved in? Atherosclerosis, breast cancer, allergies and autoimmune diseases. These 3 were much, much more rare even a couple of centuries ago. Breast cancer, my friends tell me, is 10 to 20 times more common depending. What's going on? There's a frightening slide. I like to go past it pretty quickly, but before I do, you all are told by your doctor, keep your cholesterol below 200, and yet a lot of people still get heart attacks. What's going on? Turns out if you look with data from Boyd Eaton at the levels of cholesterol in cultures where they don't eat as well or sit as comfortably as we do, they're more like 120 to 130, not anywhere near 200. The norms that we set in America for our physiology are just way off. This is another frightening slide, the epidemiological transition. Just in our lifetimes, for those of us who have been around a few years, rheumatic fever, hepatitis, all the infectious diseases have plummeted, triumphed, mostly of public health. On the other hand, at the same time, we have exponentially increasing rates of multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, and asthma. What is going on? I can tell you we don't really know. But there's something about our very modern environments that's making us very vulnerable to autoimmune diseases. This is a brave doctor who realized that cultures started getting autoimmune disease of Crohn's disease, causing terrible abdominal pain and diarrhea, inflammation in the small bowel, mainly after they had been dewormed. In the South Pacific, well-meaning doctors and helpful doctors went and dewormed whole islands in the South Pacific, and 20 years later, epidemics of Crohn's disease and asthma began. So he thought, okay, I'm going to try to treat some of my patients with worms. That's kind of bold. Turns out, though, that about 2/3 of them got remissions from their Crohn's disease that they hadn't gotten before. Now, again, I should say before I go one step further that you'll notice that I'm giving you about 120 examples in about 60 minutes. And I try very hard to keep up with all of these, and I can't. So I rely on audiences like you to set me straight about any errors you detect. That helps me a lot. This one, I have done some further reading on, and it looks like with all new published results, the follow-up studies are not as strong. But it still looks like there's an effect here. There's something about worms that protects us. How about myopia? How many of you here share my nearsightedness? And if we were on the African savanna, what would it be like? For us, it would be like, hello, kitty. I asked my professor in ophthalmology in medical school, I said, doctor, how can it be that there are these genes for myopia when it would make us just fatally flawed on the African savanna? And he said, Dr. Nesse, mutations happen. You've got to get used to it. Natural selection isn't that great. I said, okay. But now I get my revenge, because in fact, mutations do happen, and natural selection does have severe limits, but that's not the explanation for myopia. Myopia is a genetic quirk. It's a quirk in that these are not abnormal genes that are causing myopia. They're genes that interact with something in our modern environment. And exactly whether it's reading or our diets remains uncertain, which is bizarre to me. Here's an epidemic that affects 30% of people in modern populations, and we haven't really figured out what it is that's doing it. We're right on the verge of figuring this out. And right here, I've had a delightful time talking with Dan Lieberman in your Department of Human Biology. And how many people here have plantar fasciitis or bad knees or bad backs? I mean, everybody. 80% of people have bad backs at one point or another. And Dan points out that the way that hunter-gatherers run is fundamentally different from the way you run once you get in modern running shoes with a big built-up heel and no flexibility here. Essentially, you lose all of your muscular tone that makes your gait have its spring and all the rest. And you weaken these muscles, and then when you do go out running, you get plantar fasciitis and other kinds of injuries. Who ever thought that orthopedic shoes actually could be the problem, not the solution? And he's very firm about saying, don't just start going running barefoot tomorrow. It's a slow transition you would have to make to get to more normal running. But it's fascinating the number of things we do that we think are helpful that are in fact causing problems. Competition with other organisms is the second reason. This is a nice study of 480 kinds of bacteria from around the earth. How many antibiotics were they resistant to? Well, on the average, about 7 or 8. Now you got to think for a minute. So have humans been peeing on all parts of the earth enough to make organisms resistant to all these antibiotics? That doesn't make any sense. Where do antibiotics come from? They come from fungi and from other bacteria. Why? Because these guys have been involved in biochemical warfare with each other, not just for 1 million years, not just for 100 million years, but for 1 billion years. And they have been inventing, evolving all kinds of molecules that get them an advantage ever since, and we exploit those temporarily. This is penicillin resistance to strep pneumonia. When my kids were young, gave kids a touch of penicillin, all gone. Now we're edging up towards 50% resistance or more. You all know about antibiotic resistance. There's no point in talking about it. It's a huge, huge public health crisis. We really can't keep ahead of how fast bacteria can evolve. One reason, perhaps, is that we're not really using evolutionary biology. A wonderful article by Antonovics and Ploss points out that medical journals are nervous somehow about using the E word. In medical journals, only about 10% or fewer use the word evolution to describe antibiotic resistance. In proper evolution journals, it's more like 60 or 70%. I don't know why doctors are nervous about the E word, but it's surprising. Is it significant in any way? It's very significant. This is my friend Carl Bergstrom, who's a mathematical evolutionary biologist. And this next part I'm going to tell you is grossly simplified, but still useful. Sometimes doctors who want to do evolutionary medicine have thought, okay, let's prevent antibiotic resistance. How about if we all agree in this hospital we use antibiotic A for the first 6 months, and then we'll all switch to antibiotic B, and then we'll all switch to antibiotic C. This was actually done in a number of hospitals. But you can't just have an intuitive feel about how natural selection works. You've got to do the math. And if you do the math, Carl demonstrated that what these well-meaning so-called evolutionary doctors were doing was almost the optimal way to generate multi-drug resistance quickly. It's serious, this lack of evolutionary thinking in medicine. Here's a good recent one. About 15% of the sugar in milk from new mother humans can't be digested by the baby. Now that's the kind of thing you could think, oh, natural selection blew it again. But let's think for a moment. Why would natural selection make a sugar that babies can't digest? Well, what can digest it? Turns out that bifido can digest it. And bifido are the good bacteria that you want in your bowel. And this gives them a head start against all the other bacteria. Really good stuff. Example 3, why our bodies aren't better. If you have a kid who's skateboarding, or you have done it yourself, you've probably fallen forward, and your wrist always breaks in exactly the same place. It's called a Colles fracture, right through the head of the bone there. Why? Why didn't natural selection make that bone thicker? So this didn't we've been falling long before skateboards. Answer is this. This is one of the miracles of human anatomy. Look at how you can do that. Do you ever think about that? And if you can do that, you can do this too. And that's very useful for early humans. If that bone was thicker, you couldn't do it. It's a trade-off. Some people have this idea that evolutionary medicine says everything in the body is perfect. If you take nothing away from this talk, please take this away. Nothing in the body is perfect. It can't be. Everything is a trade-off with something else. And there are a lot of other good reasons why nothing's perfect. Another favorite one, I wish I'd learned this in medical school. Bilirubin is the stuff that makes your eyes yellow when you have jaundice and your liver is failing. So why does the body make jaundice? Why does the body make bilirubin at all? It's a breakdown product of heme, but it turns out that biliverdin is more water-soluble. And the body spends energy to make this water-soluble stuff into something that's toxic and not water-soluble. Duh. I mean, somebody goofed in this one. But again, pause. Maybe there's a reason for it. And one of the places in our book where George and I reached and made a good guess with some information, bilirubin is a pretty good antioxidant. Now people say, how do you test theories like this? Or is this just all so stories? No, you can really test them. This is the same way you do other science. In this case, you do a knockout study. This is a cycle that goes from biliverdin, the water-soluble stuff, to bilirubin that makes you yellow with jaundice. And it turns out that Sedlick and Schneider made a knockout. They knocked out this, and it turns out every time the cycle goes around, it knocks out a lipophilic reactive oxygen species. Those are the things that glom onto cells and essentially fry them. And if you knock out the gene that makes bilirubin, cells die very quickly from damage from oxygen. Pretty good evidence that the bilirubin is there for good reason. The question I asked myself as a sophomore undergraduate is, why is there aging? I'd never found Williams' famous 1957 paper in which he pointed out that there are two possible reasons. One was already well known. Hey, after a certain age, selection isn't working anymore. At least by age 100, selection is not working. Kin selection not accepted. However, what about genes that might be selected for even though they cause aging? What if a gene makes your bones heal more quickly, but it also causes calcium deposition in your coronary arteries? And he pointed out, hey, that gene is going to be selected for even if it eventually kills everyone. This is called the pleiotropic theory of aging. Pleiotropic just means multiple causes of the same gene. Profound advance that's led to a revolution in gerontology and studies of aging. This is a graph I made to amuse myself once upon a time about what if we eliminated aging? What if the mortality rate throughout the entire human lifespan stayed the same as it is at age 18? Well, in that lucky instance, about a third of us have lived to be 1,000 years old. But we don't. That's too bad. Beta amyloid is the nasty stuff that collects on your neurons and causes Alzheimer's disease. At least it's very strongly associated. And Eli Lilly did a giant study the last few years with a chemical that blocked beta amyloid synthesis. And they were hoping that if you get rid of the beta amyloid, you would relieve the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Nothing is more needed in medicine now than some way to counter Alzheimer's disease and obesity. Those are the two big ones. This fellow thought for a minute and said, well, maybe there's some reason the body's making this stuff. I think I'm going to grind up some brains of people with Alzheimer's disease and see what they do to bacteria. He found out that they stop bacteria from growing. And then he used synthetic beta amyloid and found out that they do stop bacteria from growing. And then in the coup, he reverse synthesized the sequence for beta amyloid the other direction. Turns out if you synthesize it the other direction, it's not a good antimicrobial. Isn't that cool? Now, this doesn't lead you to any conclusions. It doesn't tell you that it's really an antibiotic. It just tells you we should be thinking about why it's there instead of just assuming it's something bad that we're going to get rid of. And this little escapade cost Eli Lilly about $200 million or more. And we're still trying to find things that interfere with beta amyloid, and maybe that will work. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, just saying we should think. Here's another good one. How about this one? This fellow published an article saying that genes for type 1 diabetes, the kind that means you need to use insulin, might have evolved to protect against tissue death and from freezing in the ice age. And the evidence is that there are lots of animals like frogs and fish that increase the glucose in their cells when they almost freeze in the winter, and it protects their cells from damage. Now think with me for a second. Type 1 diabetes, insulin, no insulin, what happens? You die. This doesn't sound like anything natural selection would actually shape, does it? And in fact, when a newspaper editor called me and asked me about this article, I said, "Are you kidding me? Don't you know that diabetes is an autoimmune disease that affects and it kills people? And this is preposterous. Please don't publish this." But they did, and it spread all around the world in all the leading newspapers. And there's a message in this for us that's terribly important. The message is that this is very difficult science. This was a leading science editor for a leading paper. This is very difficult science, and a lot of times smart people think things are true when they're really preposterous if you look into them in any detail. Now, this led me to spend a lot of the last year writing an article called 10 Questions for Evolutionary Studies of Disease Vulnerability. If any of you teach courses in this or are interested, please take a look at that. I wrote it because I was so sick and tired of my students writing papers that were kooky. And I wanted them to have some guide. If you can answer these 10 questions and get through it, then you got a good start on something that might be sensible. There's so many elementary mistakes that are so easy to make. This is very hard science to do. 4, constraints. There are a lot of things natural selection can't do. Path dependence and mutations. A little quickly here, the octopus eye, no blind spot. How come we have a blind spot and they don't? It's just bad luck. In the origins of the tissues that led to our eyes and their eyes being different. There's no other explanation. But once you go down that path, you can't, evolve in a way that leads to 10,000 generations of blind humans in order to fix it. This is just never going to happen. And finally, we go to somatic selection. That means selection of cell lines within your body. And unfortunately, one place this happens is the immune system, which is nice. But in this one, it also happens in cancer, tumors. And something I've just begun to grasp, when you think about cancer, it's this awful image. There's something in there that's growing, and it just grows, right? But think for a moment, what percentage of new cells that bud off of that tumor survive in the tumor? About 1%. 99 out of 100 die. This means there's very strong selection in the tumor for those cells that can survive and be the most nasty. This is profoundly important for deciding on cancer chemotherapy. And again, when I was a resident physician just learning medicine, I was taught we're going to use different anti-cancer agents one at a time so that we have one left in reserve in case we need it. If those doctors had really understood evolutionary biology, they would have realized they should move quickly to triple therapy, which is what we do now, using multiple agents all at once to prevent these cells from breaking through. David Haig is one of your treasures here at Harvard, and I won't try to explain his ideas in great depth, but one one complicated, rich set of ideas he's developed is about IGF-2, insulin-like growth factor 2, and the trick to this is that it turns out that it's imprinted differently if it comes through the mother or through the father. Same gene, but if it comes through it makes babies grow. And if it comes through the father, it's not imprinted. If it comes through the mother puts a methyl group on it so it can't be expressed. There's also another gene called IGF-2 receptor, which is exactly the opposite. And it's imprinted only if it comes through the father and not the mother. And he points out, what on earth is going on with this war going on between the maternal and paternal genomes? Turns out that he suggested that maybe this has some selective benefit in that maternal genomes benefit from limiting the amount of investment in that particular offspring because you'll be able to save them for the next one. Paternal genomes benefit from extracting as much nutrition from that particular female as possible for this particular baby. It's very hard to prove this theory in a way that everybody will go along, but it's such creative thinking. And it might well turn out to be right. Profound implications for birth size, smaller infants that are born with low birth weights and the like. Health is not selection's goal? How can that possibly be? Well, think about it for a moment. There's a mutation that makes some individuals have more babies but die young. What happens to that mutation? It spreads. Do we have any examples of this? We do, actually. There's one sex among us that is relatively feeble from an evolutionary point of view. You know who you are. If you go to a nursing home and you look around, there are very few of us guys left. We die on the average 70 years younger than women. I tried to find that number, 70 years, couldn't find it, but the World Health Organization has all the data you need for a great summer in your basement with an Excel spreadsheet, which is how I spent my summer. Looking at the mortality ratio of male mortality to female mortality, anything over 1.0 means that more men are dying, okay? And they not only have the data by age, by sex, by decade, and by country. So Dan Kruger and I have had a good time publishing on this. This is our most famous graph showing that even before puberty, men are dying 50% more than women. And in Boston today, for every 100 women who die at age 20, about 300 men will die. Can you believe that? 3 times as many? Anybody want to start men's health programs? There is a very simple, small operation you could do to minimize your risks. Nervous laughter indicates you understand. Notice also the difference between countries. It's dramatically different in different countries, with Colombia and Russia way at the top and Singapore and others at the bottom. This is a great heuristic value, this evolution stuff. It gets you to ask new questions you just wouldn't have asked before, and you see things that you wouldn't have come up with. Last, defenses and suffering. It seems like somebody was being quite nasty in designing it. A lot of diseases are, seizures, cancer, those are diseases. But a lot of the problems people bring to their doctors are defenses: fever, cough, pain, anxiety, and depression, or at least low mood. These aren't diseases. These are useful responses if they're expressed in the right circumstance. And it was Ed Wilson who inspired me about this. I was in my psychiatry residency on the ward with all of these people with terrible emotional disorders, and I read this paragraph. Love joins hate, aggression, fear, expansiveness, withdrawal, and so on, in blends designed not to promote happiness of the individual, but to favor the maximum transmission of the controlling genes. I thought, oh my God, I haven't understood the body. I haven't understood anything about, I've had an entire wrong impression. I thought everybody behaved to maximize health, and it's not true. And it just hit me like a bolt of lightning. And then I decided to get really serious about this evolution of medicine stuff. In my work as a psychiatrist, I see a lot of people with panic disorder. And for years, I tried to explain to them, it's not your heart. No, you're not having seizures. It's your locus ceruleus in the brain firing too much. It's the noradrenergic stimulation only. And my patient said, thank you very much, Dr. Nesse. Do you know if a cardiologist I could see? So finally, I started realizing a panic attack is a fight-flight response. That's a false alarm. And this made me start wondering, what is it we're doing in medicine? When we're blocking defensive responses right, left, and sideways, are we hurting people? If natural selection is so great, you just think it would express defenses only when they're really needed. If that fellow is coming towards you, should you run? Yes. If you are at a watering hole and you hear a little noise behind a rock that sounds like this, what should you do? It could be a lion, it could be a dog, it could be a monkey, it could be just rustling of leaves in the wind. Should you run? Well, it's another kilometer back to camp, and you'd like to bring water to your family, so you don't want to give up too easily. But on the other hand, if it's a lion, so what do you do? You've got to calculate this, and you're not going to use calculus. All organisms have to make these kinds of decisions. How did they do it? So I ended up having another long summer learning math I never thought I'd want to learn. Let's pretend, for instance, that the cost of fleeing is 200 calories. The cost of not fleeing, if it's a lion, is 200,000 calories. So it's optimum to flee whenever the probability of a lion is greater than 1 in 1,000. You know what that means? This means that 999 times out of 1,000, the panic attack will not be necessary, but it will be perfectly normal. Again, this changed my fundamental view of what I was doing as a physician. Natural selection has all kinds of defensive responses going off too much, too early, or too long, and too intensely. Pain, fever, nausea, and all the rest. This doesn't mean natural selection goofed. This is a signal detection theory analysis you need. We call this the smoke detector principle. You can look it up that way if you want to. It means that false alarms are normal. This is why, what do general physicians do? Half of what they do is block normal defensive responses. So why aren't there dead bodies outside the door of any general physician's office? And the answer is the smoke detector principle. We can block these responses safely, except for that one time in 1,000. And the mission here is not to have doctors not treat with aspirin or always treat with aspirin. The principle is we'd like to teach doctors to think using proper evolutionary and mathematical principles about when and which patients should get which substance to block their defensive responses. You will have smoke detectors. You put up with lots of false alarms because if that's happening, you want to know very early and get out. This is the slightly fancy math that you use to actually figure out what the threshold is. Depends on the costs and the benefits and the signal-to-noise ratio. It's fun math if you want to get into it. So summarizing this part, I only have a little part after this. Why is the body better? 6 good reasons. We've gone through all of them. And the point is, not that every disease needs an evolutionary explanation. I should change that. It is that every disease needs to be considered in terms of why the body isn't shaped in ways that make the body more resistant to that disease. Its vulnerabilities we're trying to explain. Now I'd like to emphasize once again that this business of why bodies are not better is but one subfield of evolutionary medicine. It's by no means the whole thing. Lots of other areas. So this is just one small part I'm talking to you about today. But I think there is a giant change that all of this implies that, again, has helped me. I've always basically thought about the body as a machine. That's what we're all taught. And it's been a gradual transition to realize that's not right. Bodies are not machines. We use this metaphor. It's helped us to avoid vitalism, but it's a mistake. The body is shaped by natural selection, and my recent hobby horse is the phrase organic complexity, which is different from any kind of mechanical or computer complexity. Not just more complex, but differently complex. The body's not a machine. It was not designed. It was shaped by natural selection. This is the body with a recurrent laryngeal nerve, for instance, going down from the brain, down around the aorta, and coming back. It's cockamamie scheme, you know. Why? It's because it's shaped by natural selection. And just for those of you who are in medical school or physicians, you had to memorize the Krebs cycle at least 6 times and parrot it back. But I'd like to tell you that they were tricking you into thinking that it's simple. This is the real Krebs cycle. That's much more what's really going on. You also had to memorize how different white cells interacted with each other. But if you look at this, it's not like anything any engineer would design. You can't see the small parts here, but interleukin-4 goes from T cells to basophils. It also goes from T cells to B cells. It also goes from macrophages. All these substances are swirling back and forth between all of these different kinds of white cells. You could try to program it and decode it, but this is nothing like anything engineer would do. Our models that we use with little arrows and boxes just can't do justice to the kinds of complexity we see in evolved systems. Last example, a clotting cascade. Another one, any doctor memorizes once or twice, at least, in their education. So, and our human minds need this kind of thing to try to make sense of things. What's really going on in the clotting cascade? Well, it's much more like that. And you can't memorize that, so it's no surprise you can't get it in a textbook. But we should be trying to help our students realize that this is the kind of thing that natural selection shapes. And this is why it's so hard to have targeted drugs that do everything you want and nothing else. Point, the body's not like a watch. Nothing like a watch. Nothing like any machine. It's much more like a tangled bank. It's a much more organic, ecological set of interacting cells and genes and all the rest. So the conclusion, evolution offers medicine a lot. It offers specific methods, such as tracing phylogenies and calculating population genetics. It offers a framework for physicians to organize those 10,000 facts you need to learn. Offers a biological view of the body. And I think for me personally, it just gives you a feeling for the organism, in a very famous biologist phrase, that's very different from the feeling you get from a non-evolutionary view of the body. We do need some things now. Education at all levels, Medical school, how many medical schools have a course in evolutionary biology? 0 in the world. How many have at least 2 hours of lecture? About 4 or 5 in this country, more in Europe. It's really pathetic. But medical schools are, like the human eye, a product of path dependence. And it's very hard for them to make big changes, especially since they don't have evolutionary biologists on the faculty. But I think they will. It may take another 20 years, but we'll try to speed it along, those of us who are working in this area. We're creating training programs for evolution medicine researchers. And what's desperately needed, NIH does not have research funding for any of the questions I've just talked to you about. And it's no wonder. It's a combination of politics and people not really recognizing that you can scientifically address these questions about adaptation. But I think it'll come. A lot of young people who are interested in this kind of thing will go do PhDs and do research and become physicians, and they'll become deans, and everything will be fine. Anyone who's interested, again, our course is out at Mount Desert Island. If you're interested in that, probably there's about 3 or 4 more days till it fills up. And this is where we end, with the bridges growing, new bridge of asking evolutionary questions growing nicely. And if you want more information, it's at evmedareview.com. Thank you very much.